Welcome back to part 3 in my 4-part video series on comparative storytelling. In addition to the relationships between characters, the progression of the story in Western and Eastern narratives also has some key differences. Both being notable stories about large-scale wars, it seems only natural that we compare the Iliad to the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. As you may know, the Iliad recounts the story of the semi-mythical Trojan War from the perspective of the Greeks. Similar to what I said about pitting good against evil, the Iliad has a clear overarching conflict, that being the struggle between the Greek and Trojan heroes. Meanwhile, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms doesn't really have a central conflict. Sure, individual battles or campaigns may involve the characters struggling against some external force. However, in terms of the whole plot, there is no central conflict. Rather, the tension and drama arises from an imbalance in the delicate interconnected weave of relationships, motivations, and actions of the characters. In terms of conflict resolution, the Iliad has a clear climax, the defeat of Hector at the hands of Achilles. However, in the Three Kingdoms, the final 40 or so chapters documents the gradual decline of the kingdoms as the founding fathers die off one by one and pass their power to their increasingly corrupt and incompetent descendants. From here we can see a completely different philosophy in conflict, but fate also presents itself differently in Western and Eastern stories. Again, in the Iliad, the frequent divine intervention and emphasis on prophecy points to the idea of struggle between free will and fate. For example, Achilles is forewarned by his mother that avenging the death of Patroclus will cement his fate to be killed, and ignoring this advice, kills Hector anyway, eventually leading to his death as was foretold. In Three Kingdoms, there is a different idea of fate. Instead, I would call it something more like path, in line with the Taoist idea of the way. The Buddhist idea of dharma is also alluded to, with fate serving as a determination of what societal role one is expected to fulfill. Ultimately, the Iliad and other Western stories are driven by the characters' actions to carve some sort of fate for themselves, while in Romance of the Three Kingdoms and other Eastern stories, life is perceived as a series of unpredictable events, and the story is driven by how the characters respond to such events. This idea of climaxes and conflict resolutions hints at the difference in plot structure. Primarily stemming from Greek dramas, Aristotle's three-act structure is something we are all quite familiar with. Act 1 consists of introducing the setting, the characters, and the conflict. Then, Act 2 is the tension-building phase where the characters must face a series of challenges with increasing stakes or peril, all the way leading up to the climax in Act 3. Following the climax, the tension sharply falls as the story usually resolves quickly after the climax. A similar chart we are probably all familiar with, but have never heard of the name of, is Freytag's Pyramid. This story structure breaks down the plot into 5 phases: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. I don't need to explain what these terms mean, but the key thing to take away is that the progression of tension and the passage of time are all relatively linear and continuous. Let's see how that's different in Eastern stories. A common Eastern plot involves 4 acts in a structure called Kishotenketsu. In the first act, Ki, characters, setting, and conflicts are all introduced, similar to the exposition of Freytag's Pyramid. In the second act, Sho, the story progresses in a relatively linear fashion with little to no unexpected events, comparable to the rising action. However, the third act is where the systems diverge. In Act 3, Ten, an unexpected plot twist significantly alters or completely reverses the direction of the story. Finally, in Act 4, Ketsu, the story is wrapped up and the characters learn their final lessons. Ketsu also often ends in a cliffhanger or a thought-provoking rhetorical question. Note the lack of a need for a central conflict in this story structure, as previously mentioned. Here's a diagram representing the Kishotenketsu system. Notice that in the first 2 acts, it is practically the same as Freytag's Pyramid. However, due to the often lack of a central conflict, the climax is treated differently. The equivalent twist also usually occurs in a very short time frame, perhaps in the span of 1 day or maybe even in several minutes. Sometimes the whole story can take place in just one conversation, as we will see with the film Hero. This non-linear passage of time and progression of conflict is what I think to be the primary difference between Eastern and Western plots. The Korean film Parasite is an excellent example of Kishotenketsu. The movie follows the Kim family, a poor family that infiltrates the wealthy Pak household by becoming the latter's housekeeper, tutor, art teacher, and chauffeur. Each member of the Kim family adopts a persona and pretends to be an unrelated group of workers in the Pak house to reap the benefits of a generous pay and a nice mansion. Everything goes smoothly at first, and they successfully implant themselves into the gullible Pak family until they discover a surprising secret about the house. Obviously, I can't reveal the twist without spoiling the whole film, so I encourage you to watch this film for yourself. Nevertheless, the story follows the Kishotenketsu system very closely with twist after twist. Going back to the claim about the nonlinear progression of time, most of the drama in this movie, almost 2/3 of the movie, occurs within the span of 24 hours. This non-linearity is further explored in Zhang Yimou's movie Hero. The film tells the story of an assassination attempt on the Qin Emperor through a conversation between the Qin Emperor and a nameless man that claimed to have killed the 3 most notorious assassins. In the first red version of the story, the main character tells the Emperor how he used sexual jealousy among the 3 assassins to manipulate and best them. The Emperor then replies by telling what he thinks actually happened, the blue version of the story. In this version, the nameless man teamed up with the 3 assassins to concoct the red story in order to gain the trust of the Emperor and assassinate him. The man admits that his story is indeed false, though the Emperor's is not entirely accurate either. He then explains the white version of the story, in which one of the assassins realizes that the Qin Emperor's goal to unite China would bring stability and peace to the various warring states, even in spite of his tyranny. The man then hesitates to carry out the plan to assassinate the Emperor because of the words of that assassin. Meanwhile, the Emperor recounts the Green Tale, the first attempt by the 3 assassins several years ago to assassinate him. The presentation of this movie as a frame story is incredibly revealing indeed of the subjectivity of Eastern stories. More specifically, Eastern audiences enjoy seeing or hearing the differing subjective perspectives of each of the characters and extrapolating a cohesive narrative from each point of view. In a similar fashion, In a Grove by Ryonosuke Akutagawa tells a murder mystery story through the accounts of 7 individuals. The testimonies don't exactly match up with each other, rather providing one part of this whole story or warping the events to fit their preconceived notions. Each account gives a little bit more information about what actually has happened, and it's up to the reader to reconstruct the whole narrative by piecing together the different recounts of the murder. Eastern readers take pleasure in being told a story from the point of view of many different characters with different motivations, personalities, and knowledge of the events in a sort of inverse dramatic irony. And that concludes our 3rd part in our 4-part series on comparative storytelling. Join us next time on a discussion of values.